Thanks so much for this chance. We're going to, for the third time in our relationship, we're going to shift topics. We'll be talking to a certain extent about some of the things we talked about last night. I don't think we'll get much to a New Testament anymore. What I've been asked to do is to talk about contemporary worship. And I'm going to do that mainly relative to the questions of, and again, I apologize for this, but this is all I got, how in the States we have worked to attract younger demographics to churches that are similar to how many of you must identify. This has been it's been a work of my own. So I really only pastored 2 churches. They were what we would call restarts, meaning, as I alluded to last night, places that were ready to close. And that we managed to restart them and to have them flourish, in both cases, long term. And for me, I want to say maybe the main way to authentically grow churches with younger demographics is through worship. I think that there are other things to say, but since I've been asked to talk about worship, I'm going to do that. So I'm going to mostly think with you about that. It turns out that the handout that you have left off the main page. And Margaret is cranking it out as fast as she can. So thank you so much, Margaret, for that. In the meantime, I'll deal just for a moment with the handout that we have, which is another more scholarly dimension of my work. So we're going to go mostly in this hour to thinking about contemporary worship. And again, we'll be doing that from the position I spoke last week. I'm not really interested in thinking about imagining new things. I'm just wanting to think about things that have already been done that seem to work. But it is true that sort of in relationship to that and sort of not, I happen to be also a scholar of ancient worship. And I did allude to that this morning in how the 1st and 2nd century folks worshipped. I have 4 books on early Christian worship, all of which basically go to this book. That's not my most recent on this, but it's the biggest selling one. It's called In the Beginning Was the Meal: Social Experimentation and Early Christian Identity. And what I've been working on there is to think about what it was like to worship in a lush meal setting that went on for hours. And so your handout thinks about that and gives you some information about the actual situation of the meal setting. First of all, to say that the ancient meal setting pre-existed early Christian worship. Early Christians simply gathered together in a way most people gathered together for all kinds of purposes. And in each case, it was a setting, and these, so for instance, the ancient, I've done digs on this in the Mediterranean. The ancient Mediterranean dining room is about this big. So you all, here's another wall, here's another. It's just this circle. That's how big dining room is. And everyone is reclining. So there are usually 4 sets of couches, and you can either lie on your own couch, or there are couches of two people couches. So I can do this. So if you're on a 2-person couch, there's someone as a picture of the Gospel of John with Jesus and the beloved disciple. There's someone in your bosom. So you're lying like this, and your beloved disciple has his head right here.
For people who can't hear.
Sorry. Thank you. Talk about the body of Christ.
I'll give you the minder.
That could cause an accident. And we're not quite. Oh, could I have a copy of that handout? Thank you. All right. So anyway, I just want us to have as we talk about, because I'm going to push you like crazy in this workshop to think newly about what you can do in worship. There's no direct tie between early Christian worship and what the task is now. Different cultures do different things. So I am not asking you to start reclining in worship. Your culture doesn't help you do that. Too bad that our cultures don't do that. In other words, we'd like it, especially if you had a glass of wine in your hand at the same time, but that's not the case. But I do want to say that there is, think about lying down next to someone, singing songs, drinking and eating for 3 hours together. And just for a moment, imagine what kind of person you would be if you did that every week. I think all of us would be different people, period. And the differences that I note is that we would have a range of emotions, a range of bodiliness, a range of joy, a range of emotions, and a range of community that we don't have now. In other words, perhaps the most counterculture part of the early Christ movements was simply the way they worshiped. And they weren't the only ones. That culture knew whether it was worshiping with Isis or Jesus. How to be deeper human beings than we are, in at least those ways. Probably we're better human beings than others. Because I want to get onto the other thing, that's all I have to say, but I want you to talk back to me right now about anything on what I just said.
I'm just wondering what differentiated that as worship rather than just a festive meal.
Could you say that again?
I'm wondering what differentiated that as worship and not just a festive meal.
Yeah, worship is a loaded topic. I mean, so I can say that they prayed probably much more expressively and emotionally than we did in those settings. They sang. I mean, when I would say they sang hymns, that's sort of a lie, because they sang, but their songs didn't sound like ours. I mean, for us, a hymn is a special kind of da-da-da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da-da-da, and it's 4 lines and it all rhymes, right? They were much more like chant. Well, actually, the nearest we have to how it sounded would sound strange to us and be alienating. So I do think that the meal was part of worship in that you found yourself putting things inside you. So I want to say lively bodiness helps us get things inside us, not just to nurture ourselves physically, but to nurture ourselves spiritually. Am I close to your question? No. Okay.
The meal seemed really significant, and being in community.
Yeah. And you did see last night, if you were here, St. Lydia's didn't recline, but they're at easeness, because we know how to be more at ease when we eat and drink. Does serve St. Lydia's well, in its having all of its worship in Western style meals now. So there's something to the eating. Okay.
Presumably the purpose of doing this is to, in some way, have some sort of contact with that mystery which we generally call God. What is it in what you're proposing that does that? I mean, you talk about prayer, you talk about worship, but what exactly are you doing that will give you that connection with the mystery?
I think, and this is really like your question too, so thanks so much for following it up. I think there's an opening of ourselves in worship so that we're not isolated and self-defended. That happens through singing, praying, eating, drinking, being at ease, that allows us and God to become one. Sometimes the words matter and sometimes they don't. It feels like when I think about human experience and its becoming one with God, that sometimes words matter more than other times. So I think that the early Christ folks really were helped by some of their words, and were also helped by the character of what their bodies were doing. Am I at all close to what you asked? It felt like it was such an important question. Thanks. Yes.
I'm finding it very difficult to understand what you mean when you said that the Christians lay down together and they all stayed there and prayed and eat. Now, if our children tried to bring that one on and say, oh, we're going to join a Christian club and we're all going to sleep there the night and we're going to all eat there and we're going to stay there, we wouldn't believe that this was what God wanted, and it certainly wouldn't be what we would want as parents. So what are you talking about? I can't honestly understand you.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm sorry.
No, that's really important. Yeah, I think it's almost impossible for us to understand what they were doing. we have made worship really different. So that's why I think it's to a certain extent, what I know about the ancient world is irrelevant. What I'm saying is I think that they were more accessible emotionally, more expressive of their joy and sorrow, and that they were festive in ways that we don't know how to. So emotional, festive, would be key dimensions. If we can't get the physical picture, I think that might be something that would be an interesting contrast or comparison to them. As I said, it's not in the cards for us to imitate them. All cultures worship differently according to what they know and what they've learned. But you're right, it's almost impossible for us to feature that they were doing that. Thanks. Yes, one more, and then I'm going to get on. Yes.
Thank you. Just, I guess, building on the last question and your comments, I remember when I was living in London attending a church, and a very proper English lady invited my wife and I to lunch, and her comment was, you can't really know someone until you've had their legs under your table. And I thought that was quite a nice expression of the way in which meals open up a sense of hospitality and then the reciprocal openness. And I think it's fascinating that a lot of the emerging church traditions that are coming out of a more evangelical flavour of church are also rediscovering the importance of meals together and worship in the setting of meals.
Yeah, thanks. Well, I'm so glad that you get the strangeness of it. I hope that you get the possibility of deeper emotional and embodied life too. I'm going to switch then now to our next handout. And here what I've done is I've basically put a long list of things that churches have done in the States to attract people under 40 and to transfer a dying church or a declining church into something that is attractive. Here it may be even harder to think of you doing that than what we just talked about. So what I want to say that this is not my brainstorm, it's my list of things I've seen work. We also need to let ourselves know that Americans are weird and arrogant, so that you shouldn't follow us. But I've asked, but this is the only thing I know. And last night, people said, "Oh, that can help me think further about it." So this is a really applied list. What I want to do is talk briefly about, let's say, 10 at a time, and have your responses to them. There, I also want to say, as you see at the top of the page, if you were wanting, just hypothetically, if you had a declining church, if you started on this, it feels to me as if you would need to do at least 10 of these things at once to make any headway. I'm not suggesting you do all of them. Matter of fact, I'm suggesting that you don't do some of them, depending on your greater wisdom. But I do want to sort of throw down a gauntlet to say small little things to attract a whole new demographic is proving in our country not to work. You have to be willing to give up the privilege of your age, by and large, in an older congregation and really listen to what people would like to do in worship. All right, so here we go. Let me just talk briefly about the first 10 things on the list. Movable seating in the round, adjusted so that at least 2 places for leadership be seen by all. I want to say that just doing that is world-changing. Rather than a bunch of rows where you see the back of people's heads, where you see each other. This is more or less in the round in my way, but I notice throughout our first 24 hours, we've mostly preferred the straightforward one. Projection facilities, we've got those, right? You may not, but that is important. What I'm not suggesting here is showing pictures all the time. I'm just saying the ability to show beautiful, tragic, important things in worship. Rich and striking visuals. It's amazing how we've forgotten that in most of the history of Christian worship, beauty was a primary thing, that people spent decades designing and building a beautiful place. I don't think, when we look at generally how worship is now, either its aesthetics are really out of date or don't exist at all. 4, as much natural objects as possible. Water in pools are running, not just, but including baptismal. Rocks, soil, significant plant life, animals where possible. That worship has all of those things in place. Now, I'm not talking about the zoo, but for instance, I know so many churches where the fact that someone can bring their church, their pet to worship anytime they want, and that you count on several pets in the room, simply gives you a different vibe. Sometimes it means you have to attend to barking, but that's the same thing as, the other clumsy things that we attend to in worship. Natural objects, not just a little bit around the edges, but striking natural objects that dominate the presence. 5, multiple, at least 4 microphones with easy access for the congregation. So to have microphones where anybody can speak from the floor with great ease. What that does is that shows that your worship is, as we said last night, the work of the people, not the work of the pastor. So in most churches I know, which are growing and growing especially at the young end, there'll be between 10 and 40 people speak in one worship. Few, but some explicit Christian symbols. So a lot of people who will come to Christian worship don't mind Christian symbols, but so to have a few around in prominence is fine, but to have that as a larger family of symbols makes more people comfortable. So if you only have dominant Christian symbols, you chase away a bunch of young people. You shouldn't be reactionary, I don't think, and say no Christian symbols. But this is a crucial difference. Open space for movement, dance, small group gatherings as a part of larger gatherings. So to have space where someone who's usually trained to dance as a part of worship, or maybe some people who aren't trained to get up and move, to have space for that, to have space for small gatherings where people can talk with one another for 10 minutes in a worship service. Notice how that's really hard to do when you've got hymns in back of one another. So by and large, the movable seating is part of that. But to take into account that your worship would not always be someone talking to people up front, but there would be a time for I know a really wonderful worship setting which gets about 700 at every worship. And in every time they break up, their pastor will simply say, time to break up and talk with each other about blah, 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 blah. Or time to break up and have small group prayer for 5 minutes. Small meditation spaces available for private prayer and meditation within the larger space. So, in the just as an example, in the place where I worship, because I'm retired, there's 2 spaces off to that side. Anytime you want to stop listening to whatever somebody else is saying, like the pastor or the preacher or something, or because you've been overwhelmed, you can just go over there and be silent. And probably there you'll also have beautiful objects on the wall, because you know you need rich and beautiful visuals. Probably you'll have a running stream next to it. I'm going to stop here and ask for protests, thoughts, and questions.
Con.
One of the things that we were talking about last night is perhaps one of the differences in Australia is we're much smaller than America, and we have a much smaller critical mass. So when you talk of churches of hundreds, there's probably not a lot of us that come from any churches that would have over 100 people in their congregation. And when we're talking about young people, we're talking even way smaller percentages. So how do you build, I appreciate these things, but, how do you start to build the critical mass when a lot of us are in congregations where the average age is 70?
Yeah.
Where do you make the starts?
Could we just sort of enshrine what you said? Because what I notice and I said last night, it's so silly for me to be telling you about these things because I don't know your culture well enough. You have helped me, thank you. That's really important. I would say most of the turnaround situations in the States come from very small beginnings. One of the best things to do is for a church to almost crash and burn. I don't think there's any inhibition. Matter of fact, I think there's really important advantage to starting nearly fresh. One of the things where that's not the case is when the few people left are demanding still control of the worship. But really, and across my country, one finds beautiful things growing quite rapidly. And again, I think we are more religious than you all, so I want to take that into account. But but there's growth there, and most of the growth is almost always from secular, non-churched people who are lonely and want community and want spiritual nurture. So people aren't coming because they know what church is. They're coming because they need the kind of presence that church can give if we let go of our commandingness. And I would want to say, so it's true that I've seen some churches that wait until they have a certain sum to make some of these changes. But I would say investing, I just was talking to colleagues here in the last 24 hours about the importance of you spending money here in this church. I know not all of you are in this church, in order to get good sound and light. It's, in other words, to up front make beauty and new kinds of relationship in a space happen. There's no substituting for that. So, in other words, you don't have to say, oh, we've got to have 150 or something. And my next item is never have over 200. Because there is an intimacy needed. So, again, I said last night, my last church restart began with 7 people over 70 in a place where we knew the demographics had tons of young people. Am I in your territory? Mm-hmm. Other thoughts, protests? Yes.
Oh, this is a comment really.
Please.
Just as, I suppose to the group as well as you, I guess it's a bit of a cultural thing as well. I'm a Generation Y progressive, and I don't have a lot of options. I mean, I come along to this church, but I'm probably the youngest person in the congregation, quite possibly, or one of them. And I'm not used to traditional worship style, but it's something that I accommodate for Margaret's amazing teaching and to be part of a place that shares my progressive values. So when I hear this doesn't actually sound radical to me at all. A lot of as in it sounds intuitive, I think is what I mean, rather than saying it doesn't sound radical, in that these are precisely the things that I value and want as a young progressive. And I think that, but unfortunately in this city, this is another little bit of context, this is a highly conservative city in terms of churches. The Anglican Church in Sydney is very high profile and hugely conservative, and there's a lot of young people there. And I think, which is a very alienating thing in and of itself. But I think, so I hear this and I just go, this is exactly what I crave and long for as a young-ish progressive. And I know that I'm in my 30s, I'm not in my 20s, but I imagine that those 10, 15 years younger than me are very similar. Yeah.
Thank you so much. If I can respond, so what would it be like for you and your people to not have to accommodate, but to have a space which was really welcoming to you? I think that in and of itself is a major difference between success and not. In other words, we'll just think of a relationship one has. If one has to accommodate the relationship rather than feel deeply nurtured and excited about it, one's ability to throw in oneself into that relationship is really different. And I do get a little bit, but I'm really undependable on ways of listening to you. But it feels to me as if the fact that the Anglicans and the Catholics are so, in this city, so conservative, it just leaves the other churches a wide open field in a bunch of lonely, secular people.
You made a passing reference. Sorry, I
I'm
thought he was
sorry,
bringing-
I took the phone out of your hand.
It's all right. I'll just make a quick comment and pass it back. You mentioned in passing demographics and the importance of understanding the people around you. A number of years ago now, I conducted a review for the church of an inner west parish, where I have to say that it was less than 24 people at the time, and several people who'd been coming for 20 years were introduced to me as newcomers. But we pointed them to the demographics of the area in which they lived, which was predominantly multi-ethnic at that time, and encouraged them to consider addressing the people that were there as opposed to people who were more like themselves, which is white Anglo-Celtic and aged. That parish now, having called an ethnic minister a number of years ago, now has multiple thriving multi-ethnic congregations because they took the time to look at what was around them and what were the needs of the people around them, and meet those needs rather than their own.
Yeah. Again, some of you know that as a side activity, the consultation I do for my bishop looks so thoroughly at demographics that the bishop and I have agreed we close a church and sell the building when the demographics aren't there. In other words, let the money be used someplace else where there are demographics of people that want to do that. So yeah. No, way back there. I wanted way behind you. No, I'm just kidding.
Okay.
I'm just making fun of myself, I'm sorry.
The church that I go to, I've been going for a bit over a year, and one of the forms of gathering we have or worship is around a table with a meal, and then sometimes we'll go into the round and have conversation. Sometimes it's just a meal that's kind of on a schedule thing. I find though that the conversation is very stilted, and even though there's people who've known each other for a long time and people with varying on the fringes of society might come to that. But it's small, it doesn't grow, and it's quite stilted and awkward. So I wonder what shifts it from, like obviously there's been an attempt to create something like this, but it isn't I don't think it's thriving and I don't think it's growing. And yeah, I wonder what's needed to make that shift into something that's more vibrant and relaxed. And
Yeah. I want to say I probably know nothing to help you. I would have to know more. But I would want to say that leadership at the clergy and lay level for thinking about what you do when you talk needs to be really talented. In other words, to help people do that together is really important. Then I would wonder about the larger demographic, whether there are people to come or not. And frankly, even though I'm like the ancient meal guy, I think doing meals first is really hard. It's just the production skills of that are strong. Now, St. Lydia's has gone against the grain and is really doing it well. I think anything else I say would be presumptuous. I'd be happy to talk afterwards. Mm-hmm. Okay, one more and then I'm going to go on. Yes.
Yeah. Well, we talk about worship, but we're not talking about what or who we worship. And in my sphere, I use the phrase, keep it simple, the KISS principle, keep it simple, stupid. The purpose of our worship is Jesus, and the principles upon which his message was given us is love, compassion and forgiveness. Now, these things are hardly ever mentioned in the church, in that the idea of loving one another. And that's very, very simply done, very simple to do, to worship the principle of we are all one and we should love, have compassion and forgive one another. Now, that's so simple and so easy to do. Why do we not just do it?
Thank you so much for those wise words, and thank you for understanding that that's not what I'm focusing on. I'm going to go on. By and large, no more than 200 seating capacity. So one of the things we know is that for, and this does relate actually to what you were saying, the possibility of a feeling of intimacy, of a community caring for one another, is crucial in this kind of trying to attract lonely people without community. What we've noticed in the States is when you get beyond 200 there, you can't do that near as well. And what's best to do is start another service. I mean, it's not rocket science. So when you get too big for at least 30 people to be able to talk in worship, because there are too many there, then you, how could it be really hard to say, oh dear, we have to have another worship service? Worship leadership seated among the people, robe, vestments, dresses, ties, optional. We can't find any real big clarity on whether being dressed up in old kind of robes helps or not. I think right now it seems like it helps some young people and doesn't help others. So there's no wisdom on that, but that the worship leaders are not separated is really important. That the worship leader comes out of the congregation to worship, empowers everyone to speak their word. Downgrade place of the sermon in the larger worship. No more than 15 minutes devoted to sermon. Most of the activity in the worship devoted to, and here's a list that's going to come more explicitly, devoted to singing, other kinds of music than singing, collective meditation and prayer, silence, readings, drama, dance, children. So here, the main thing I want to say is the sermon, having good worship, good preaching is really important. But what we're finding is that if the sermon takes up too much space, it ends up being counterproductive to the building of the caring community that is necessary. Sermons are short, well-crafted, emotionally present, and socially aware. In other words, no matter whether it's a 5-minute sermon, which is sometimes really good, or 15 minutes, it needs to be really good. It also needs, and that goodness needs to include a deep awareness of what it means to be a young person in this culture. Singing that is primarily world music, chanting, responses to meditation and prayer, new compositions. Hymns comprise no more than one per worship. So hymns have had a wonderful place in the last several centuries of Protestant worship. And I'm not interested in denying that, and that some people are still a part of that demographic that like it. it feels to me like also hymns have seeped out into the larger culture, so you can find pop stars sometimes singing a hymn, right? So it's not that hymns need to be abolished, but if you're interested in under 40 folks, you need to actually do their music. It needs to be primarily participatory, so that people find themselves singing. And when you look deeply into what the under 40 crowd are listening to, it's not hymns. I wouldn't want to say that it's not classical music, but classical music isn't in charge. Other kinds of music than singing focuses on meditation, prayer, praise, lament. Such music features both professional and congregational participation. A variety of musical world music, jazz music, and classical music called instruments, as well as a healthy dose of a cappella music, both performed professionally and with the congregation. So here you get a little bit of a sense of what you might replace most of the hymns with, is kinds of music where the lonely person or the person who doesn't know what it means to be in worship feel comfortable, but find themselves participating, not just looking at someone else like it is on TV. Collective meditation and prayer is the predominant dimension of worship. A significant portion of the worship, no less than 10 minutes, no more than 15, involves the congregation members speaking what is on its hearts and minds. These speakings are often punctuated by sung or instrumental music. In addition to this regular practice, in every worship service, specific worship services ask for times of silence, speaking, and singing about particular kinds of moments: sadness, joy, grief, longing, confusion, seasons of the natural and liturgical year, national or regional happenings, tragedies, and festive moments. So this seems, at least from the American perspective, a done deal. If you don't have between 10 and 15 minutes of where anybody in the congregation can stand up and say, I just lost my job, or I just saw a beautiful sunrise, or I was walking down the street and there was a crazy guy next to me. To bring the one's life into worship, not in the voice of the pastor, but in the voice of the person who experiences them, that does not seem replaceable in a kind of a welcoming. And because it works so well in so many places, it can't take more than 15 minutes. In other words, there is an endless desire for you to be a part and to say something in that church service. But if it goes too long, it is alienating to people. So it has to be 10 to 15 minutes, deeply open, deeply welcoming. And you need to fake it until you make it in this regard. So I've just trained congregations saying, if you're going to make that shift, and some of you I'm sure experienced this, if you make that shift and you are afraid no one's going to say anything, plant them. Call them up in advance and say, would you say something about your life this week? And do it to 6 people, so that it is real for the other people. And so they know next time they might do it. But you may need to plant them for a half a year. I'm going to stop here and see about comments. Yes, Narelle. Yeah, we tried to keep it away from you, didn't we?
Just listening to you, Hal, a lot of the things we do here are on the edge of what you're talking about, and some of them are very close, but sometimes it feels as if we're a little bit afraid to go too far. And I'm relatively new coming back here, and I came via a Buddhist community, and I'm used to sitting in the round, and I'm used to chanting and all that sort of thing. But I love coming back to my Christian heritage, and I actually love the hymns as well. But just the thing you were saying about being able to get up and say what's close to your heart right at that moment, being immediately present, I think we don't do that. We do something else that is very good, and that is we pray for others, and anyone can get up and pray for people in the congregation, or for what's happening in the world, or for the planet, and that's a beautiful thing. But many times I've had the feeling that I wanted to get up and say something much more personal about what was happening for me, but I felt I couldn't do that. And so I think it's I don't know whether it's a cultural thing, or whether it's just the way it's set up, or I think it's a good suggestion anyway to be able to broaden what we can say and how real we can be, rather than just praying for others. Let's face it, we really have to start with ourselves.
Thank you so much. Yes, and I apologize for not noticing how close we are to you. In other words, praying for others, and that goes together. I don't think there's a start one place and go to the other. I think it's a sloppy, intuitive mix. But yes, to be intentional about it being for oneself as well as for others is a key composition. And just to say that when churches do this, and they do this so many places so successfully, you have to have a readiness to deal with the emotion. And that's why one of the reasons we're afraid of emotion in worship. And one of the key ways to be ready is to have 3 or 4 people trained to the person who's now, after they got halfway through what they were going to say, they're in a puddle bawling. So you have 3 people in the congregation who know that could happen. They come and sit next to you, maybe take you over to the private prayer place, or even outside, to be with you and to listen to you, and then to bring you back in for a blessing.
I'm a member of this church as well, and as Narelle said, we're sort of overlapping with what you're saying, but it does seem like there's a huge amount of intentionality that is required to create the rhythm of the service. Otherwise, it may be that the same people like to share every week, or that things kind of get into this uncontrolled mode. And I'm wondering, and we're even having lots of discussions about what types of music and what do people like, and the singers and the people who aren't singing, and all sorts of things. So how do you kind of guide it to make it that everybody is involved and that it's not uncontrolled on Sunday morning?
Yeah, thanks so much. Yeah, you're hearing me correctly. I think that to a certain extent, and I don't know your church well enough, just in 2 days of preparing for tomorrow, it seems to me like there's deep work going on for the worship service. But I think that priorities in churches have sometimes shifted so that one thinks that worship is rote enough that we can just get the preparation done quickly. Frankly, it doesn't seem like that's true here, but you are right. Preparation, deep preparation for worship, is I think the only way to grow the congregation, and to convince people that it's a safe and powerful place. And so, there are lots of preparatory things, and so that means stopping doing other things so that one can do good worship. Is there another thing you said that I just forgot?
Not really, just how to guide things on the morning. How to guide things on the morning so that you don't have sort of 15 minutes of extempore when you thought it was 2 or 3 or 5.
Yeah, just be ready to make mistakes early on and then make adjustments really carefully. So, for instance, if you know that someone's going to go on and on regularly, then you take that person aside and thank them for being there and saying it would be important to not go on so long. So, I mean, no, it really has to be, and you have to lose people. If that person gets offended, then that is part of the process. It's time, and I didn't get through my list. I'm a terrible time manager. So thank you so much for taking these weird American suggestions at least half seriously. Thanks so much.